Hi, welcome to Jeremy Pryor's podcast, or what I like to call Jeremy Pryor Unfiltered. I'm his daughter and producer, Kelsey Gall, and we are excited to bring you seasons of content all the way from Tolkien to theology, from business to family. If you like to contemplate deep philosophical ideas across a wide range of topics, you've come to the right place. Make sure you give us a follow so you don't miss out on future episodes.
Hey, everybody. Sydney and I are back. We are going to talk through some things today. So I have been inviting my family members to come and hang out with me for a little bit on a Friday to talk about a few clips that I found really interesting and just want to get their reaction to. They have no idea. Sydney doesn't know what's coming. It's just me and Sid today. Again, excited to hear what you think about this. So I want to start with a little clip from Professor Nancy Pearcy. She wrote a book called The Toxic War on Masculinity. And she said something in this clip that was surprising to me that I wanted to get your reaction to, Sid, and I thought we could discuss. So let me pull it up here.
I was surprised to learn from your book that you made the point that the vote was not necessarily popular with women back when female suffrage was being debated. That seems extraordinary to our ears, the idea that there would have been women who thought this was not a good idea. Was that somehow part?
So we're talking about the vote for women. And so apparently in her book, she's making the point that early on, it wasn't necessarily a popular idea amongst women to get the vote.
Part and parcel of this attempt to rein men in that you're talking about and bring them back to the drawing board?
Absolutely.
Back to involvement?
Yes. And I didn't realize how controversial that section of the book would be, but I've had a lot of people contradict, like, what? But so I was very careful to quote people of the time. I have several quotes from the anti-suffragists of the day. And what they argued was they were not arguing male vote versus female vote. They framed it as individual vote versus family vote or household vote.
Right.
And they were very concerned that if men started acting unilaterally as an individual and voting, that he would no longer feel constrained to represent the whole household. And that was their concern, is that it was reducing the sense of responsibility on men. That was their concern. It was letting men off the hook, right? It was saying, you can go vote however you want and not think about the impact on your whole family, your whole household. You remember, households were bigger than just a nuclear family then, too. Usually it was extended family and possibly servants and hired hands and others, would all. And the father was the head of that small commonwealth and was supposed to vote for the interest of the whole. In fact, the whole notion of authority back then, today we think authority kind of.
So maybe just pause there for a second. That really shocked me. I'm curious to say what you think. That the argument that the anti-suffragists, these are women who were against women getting the right to vote, which is, it's very hard to even imagine. But this argument is fascinating to me. And it really suggests that there was a completely different framework for authority in the past, which is something I've uncovered over and over again in virtually every civilization that I've studied, and that is so different than today. We live in a completely individualistic society. So if anyone were to say women should not have the right to vote, I couldn't imagine somebody thinking, well, yeah, because you don't want to take that responsibility away from fathers because it lets them off the hook for the household. Like that, I could never imagine anyone making that argument. But if you live in a society that's primarily household oriented, and women and children are constantly at the mercy of men, if they are thinking about the women and children in their household, like if their quality of life is dependent on the father of that household providing for them, taking care of them, if that's just the way society was just designed, then it makes sense all of a sudden that as a woman, you would not want anything to happen to cause that man to start to think of himself as an individual primarily, because that would put you and your children at great danger. And this is precisely what happens all the time. Unless you give power to the individual women and children, in which case they can overcome the neglect and abuse of the father, but then the result of that would predictably be the dissolving of the household, which is precisely what happened. I just found this a really interesting kind of chain of thinking that I'd never even been exposed to before. Yeah, what do you think of this?
Yeah, I kind of wonder what came first, like a chicken or the egg. Like, is this like the voting issue? Is that part of what caused so much
Yeah,
um of the individualistic, or was it the individualistic first and then there was the voting stuff and the suffragist movement and all that? There's so many issues nowadays that feminists fight for that I feel like do leave men off the hook sometimes. So
yes,
it's like that's kind of what they're fighting for. Maybe that's not what their goal is, but that is where we're ending up a lot of the times because now women are going to be more like, go get them, go get an education, get a career, all that stuff. And then the guys are cool, just, doing whatever. And so if there's no responsibility put on their shoulders of you have the one vote of the family, you have to make sure that you're representing the family well. Like, if you take away things like that, then just, like, little by little, the responsibility will fall from their shoulders and
yeah. Well, I've wondered personally as a father how to vote. Am I voting on behalf? I've wondered this many times going to the voting booth, asking myself the question: am I voting for what I think would be best for my family, or am I asking what's best for me personally? And it seems like, I mean, when your grandpa, my father-in-law, Don Seeley, I asked him to send me a voting guide, every time, just to understand his thinking and to say, it seems like we should be voting as a block for our family, as a voting block. But to imagine in a household, a husband and a wife walking into a voting booth and essentially canceling out each other's votes. The man voting for his interests, which are masculine interests, the woman voting for her interests, which are feminine interests, and then them basically, you know, that seems like such a weird scenario to create, within a democracy.
yeah.
Understandable. I mean, what else are you going to do? I mean, I think all the other answers are equally confusing, in different directions. But yeah, that does seem to be a strange thing that we've created, and that, man, you don't want men to think that way. Like, you don't want men who are responsible for a vulnerable wife who's having multiple children and pregnancies, and is trying to care for those children, to be thinking of himself primarily as an individual and going into whatever power scenarios he's going into, like voting, exclusively thinking about himself. But we have sort of created a situation now, because the problem is the opposite. Imagine if you convinced men to vote for the family, but you convinced women to vote for women. You sort of create a sort of a game theoretic problem in that scenario where men would be better off. They have to somehow counterbalance this massive tide of sort of female power that's not considering the family. And so it would then create often a counter reaction, because what happens, let's say, if the men are voting for what's best for the household, women are voting for what's best for women, and men suddenly start to lose their ability to lead their households because of the power structure shifting. And so now all of a sudden they feel that it's in their best interest to vote for what's best for men as opposed to their household. And now you've got a basic gender battle going on for power. And always the loser in that scenario is children, the household itself. And this is kind of what we keep creating, I think, inadvertently. I don't think this is being properly exposed as the frame for what's actually happening, but it seems like it's happening.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the specifically female or, like, feminist policies are anti-family. Like, it's just a sad truth that's, like, if you are fighting for individual rights as an individual for women, that's gonna make you not have kids, it's gonna make you prioritize career, which is all stuff that, you know, is not ideal for family, ideal for children. So, it's like you kind of have to pick one or the other. And so you're either gonna pick individualism or familyism.
Yeah.
And along with that goes the voting, which I do get why nowadays the voting, like, does like, women do need votes because of how much the family unit has fallen apart. So
Yes.
it's not like I wanna change that now, but it's just like
it would have been a better design just
Right.
overall. So,
If there was a household vote and the husband and wife were a team and they were working together, yeah, there's something there that's actually makes more sense of governance and is consistent with the reality of building up strong households that
yeah.
has been neglected. Okay, let's finish her argument and see where she takes it next.
Means I get to do what I want. Back then, the concept of authority was you have responsibility for the common good of the whole. It came out of classical republicanism, but that was the father was considered not just an individual, but he spoke for the whole. He had responsibility for the common good of the whole. And so that's what people were afraid that would be lost, that it was a much bigger question than we tend to realize, that it was a question of whether we would lose a political philosophy that focused on the common good and making the person an authority responsible for the common good of the whole. And so that would affect families. Of course, it affects churches and schools and civil society as well. But here we're talking specifically about how it affected fathers. And how did we lose that? Well, first it started when we had universal male suffrage. When men could vote, even if they weren't head of household. Well, then women looked at that and said, well, wait a minute, men are already voting as individuals. If men are voting as individuals, they're not taking the household into account, then we'd better have the vote. And it's kind of poignant because you read the quotes from the day, and literally one of a labor union leader, female, said, women need the vote because men, even good men, cannot be trusted to take our interest into account. So the shift in political philosophy that said the person in authority no longer is responsible for the common good meant women felt like they were no longer being protected by a man who represented the household. So that was really quite sad. That was an important step in women losing their trust that men would in fact take responsibility for their whole family and household.
Well, one of the things she says there I think is really critical is that female suffrage was created by male suffrage, male universal suffrage, right? In other words, to give every single man the right to vote simply because he's male
Mm.
necessitates giving every single woman the right to vote. Because to not do that is to basically have this misogynist, misogynist governing structure. Another alternative to that is to give households a vote. And that this, I think, goes back to early sort of republics that required, somebody to own land in order for them to have the right to vote. So the sense was their um, their land ownership was sort of indicative of the fact that they're leading a household, right? That they own assets and they're managing assets on behalf of a larger entity, and so they already are within the realm of governance. This when I started studying Roman law, one of the things that was really interesting to me was that the patris familia, who is the father of the of the household within a Roman structure, was actually considered a part of the government. Like they were a branch of the government. And so the typical patris familia was a man who had, 15, 20, 30 people under um his leadership, right? So this included obviously his wife and children, but also their servants or slaves or employees, whoever he was providing for. And so he was actually, personally liable for things that would happen. Um, uh, if they were people underneath his authority. He wouldn't necessarily be criminally liable in the same way they would be, but he would be liable. Like he would, if you had somebody underneath your household that went and created some kind of economic damage to somebody else, then it wouldn't be the person who did the damage that would be responsible. It would be the father of the household that person was being that was under, that would be responsible for that as well. So this seems consistent. I'm kind of like just trying to tease out her argument, trying to understand. It's not. I think to make it male female is way too simplistic. She's making a
Yeah.
more sophisticated argument than that.
I think it is, like, natural for the suffragists to come to that conclusion, though. Like, yeah, if just individual men, just from the fact of them being men, get a vote, then I feel like the next logical jump would be to let women have that too.
Yes.
But it's so, like, if we had stayed with the old, way of doing things, I wonder what our society would look like now, because I feel like that was a big step in making it more individualistic and, like, and less of a family unit. We're taking a lot of power away from the family unit and a lot of power away from the head of those units.
Right.
Um,
Well,
yeah.
you can imagine the Constitution. The Constitution does not mention household or family one time.
Mm,
And you can imagine, let's say in the Bill of Rights or in one of the articles in the Constitution, let's say it delineates the rights of the household, then this would change. This would have been clear. But in the Bill of Rights, all of those rights are given to the individual, and there are no special rights or responsibilities given to the household. Um, so yeah, that's kind of I think that was the beginning of the framing that made this virtually this was going to become inevitable. All right, we'll let her finish her argument here.
That's an interesting light, in a sense, to shine on the fact that, believe it or not, Australia and New Zealand were the first places where the vote was extended to women. It happened in New Zealand first, although the laws to allow women to vote first happened in South Australia, the state of South Australia, down here quite early on. And in South Australia, it was led by, interestingly, Christian women, the Women's Temperance Alliance, it was known as. And they must have already reached the point where they felt their men were not necessarily to be trusted with looking after their best interests in terms of the thinking that you put forward, which may very well have been true. They might have been right.
Well, it took a century. It took roughly a century. Yes, eventually women came around to supporting the vote. And why? The women's, you're right, here in the States as well, the women's temperance movement changed their mind on the vote. But here's what they did. They renamed the vote the Ballot for Home Protection. The women's temperance movement said we need to give women the vote because women who have alcoholic husbands who are coming home and beating them have no recourse. And so if women have the vote, they can hold men in check. Remember, this is the temperance movement. So they're very concerned that men are drinking away the family money and they're coming home and beating their wives and children. And so they eventually came to see the vote as a way of giving women a voice for temperance. You have to put this in context. Sometimes a single fact can help. In 1830, Americans drank 3 times as much as they do today. So there's a reason there was a temperance movement. Public drunkenness had become quite a problem. People falling down drunk in the alleys and so on. And so you're right. Eventually, women started saying the vote is going to give women some leverage against these male vices, in particular alcoholism that's destroying our families. So that's why they changed their perspective and began to support the vote.
Yeah. That does make a lot more sense. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, the whole household voting system works in an ideal world, but you give men a lot of responsibility in that kind of world, and if they drop the ball, then the women and the children suffer. So, I can definitely understand why the women just didn't trust men anymore to represent them well,
Yeah.
and so they just had to represent themselves.
Yeah. I think it's really important to really understand what she just gave that one quote that people drank 3 times more alcohol in 1830 than they do today. I didn't realize that until I watched, I think, Ken Burns's documentary on Prohibition, I'd recommend everybody watch. I had no idea the level of alcoholism that existed, especially when they started to distill whiskey. Before that, when primarily you would drink beer and then maybe wine, there was just a limited amount, or it wouldn't get you as drunk. It took a lot more. But once they figured out how to distill whiskey, it was like it was like a virus that got unleashed on humanity that humanity didn't have any immunity to. It's like people got drunk because you could get drunk just drinking 3 or 4 shots of whiskey, and now you're inebriated. And so men were doing this in ways that had never been done in history, just because of the potency of the alcohol that was being created, and the volume of the alcohol being created, and they were making it less expensive. And so, yeah, this was horrible for women and children. So when you have a generation that does that, we haven't recovered. Like, and I don't think we've properly, because a lot of times people look back on prohibition. This is constantly made fun of. This is one of the reasons why I find this documentary so useful, is that people always use prohibition as a cautionary tale for how stupid the government can be. But you didn't live the lives of the women who were voting for prohibition.
Mhm.
Man, they were living in a different world than we've ever seen. The level of alcoholism was unbelievable. And yeah, it didn't work, and it created the mafia and all kinds of problems. But it, they were dealing with the problem. And in reality, even when we say it didn't work, we never got back to the level of alcoholism that existed before prohibition. So maybe, at least in part, it did work,
Yeah.
and is now no longer necessary. But to say that the cure was worse than the disease is maybe too simplistic, a historic assumption. There were certainly horrible things about that cure that were created, but man, the disease was bad. All right. Well, I just love that discussion. This is definitely something that people never want to talk about. Talking about female suffrage in any kind of critical way. So it's like,
Yeah.
that was very bold, that they were even willing to have that discussion. I thought, oh, we should, and I just was shocked by where it went, just straight into a whole understanding of the household that ceased to exist, that I wish we were more familiar with. All right, that's the first one I had for you. I'm going to pull up the next one here. All right, so Matt Walsh did this thing, the villains who were right. This is a great little video, but I really was curious what you thought about this particular part of it.
Number 5, finally, is Beauty and the Beast. Now, we've talked about this before. I consider it to be one of the most important issues that I discuss. It probably deserves to be the subject of its own documentary. Gaston is the quintessential.
Just to make sure you understand the context, he's going to make the argument that Gaston is the hero and the Beast is the villain. Okay.
Villain who was actually the hero of the story.
Hello, Belle.
Bonjour, Gaston.
And I will insist on this until my dying breath. We're supposed to hate Gaston from the beginning because why? He's manly and in good shape. He eats a lot of eggs. Is that his crime? What has he done wrong?
It's not right for a woman to read. Soon she starts getting ideas and thinking.
They never explain it. And the anti-Gaston propaganda is laid on thick from the very beginning, but even in spite of that, it's clear who the real protagonist is. We see Gaston early in the film.
What a pleasant surprise.
Right? He's dressed to the nines. He visits Belle to propose marriage.
Say you'll marry me.
And he's obviously an advocate of traditional marriage and the nuclear family. He even says that. He makes a pitch for the nuclear family, traditional marriage to Belle. He's explaining.
We'll have 6 or 7.
Dogs?
No, Belle. Strapping boys like me.
He wants to have children. He wants to have a family. It's a very lovely thing. Belle turns him down and pushes him into a mud pit. Total humiliation. And yet by the end, Gaston is still willing to risk his life to rescue this woman who humiliated him from the clutches of a beast. And how did Beauty end up in that situation? Yeah, she initially went to the Beast Castle to save her dad or whatever, I think.
How did you find me?
But she had many opportunities to escape after that point. Like, she could have just walked out. I mean, she was in the prison cell, and then she's invited to dinner. And from that point on, she doesn't go back to the prison cell. So she could have left anytime. But she stays because she ends up falling in love with a non-human creature who looks kind of like an evil water buffalo. Keep something in mind. Belle didn't know that the beast was really a human prince. She had no idea about that, okay? That's true. Look up on that. You can go back and watch the movie. She never is aware of that fact. That was just luck of the draw. So as far as she knew, she was entering into a romantic relationship with a member of another species. Okay, that's a simple fact. Now, of course, poor Gaston, he didn't know about any of this. He didn't know that the beast was really a prince. He didn't know that the woman of his dreams had fallen in love with a giant mutant mountain goat. All he knew from his perspective was that Beauty had been imprisoned by a monster. Her own dad told Gaston that.
Who's got Belle locked in a dungeon?
A beast! A horrible, monstrous beast!
And so he rallies the troops. He marches off to fight for her and save her. This is the villain of the story? The man who ultimately gave his very life for the woman he loved? And the monster who kidnapped a young woman is supposed to be the one we're rooting for? That's just wrong. And I won't stand for it.
All right. Well, what do you think, Sid?
Well, I think there are a few things that he misinterpreted,
Okay.
but like for instance, when he I honestly couldn't tell if he was joking about like the anti-propaganda because of him saying women shouldn't read, they'll get ideas. So I think, but like part of what he was saying, I agree with. Like he wanted, like his goal was to be like the man of the relationship, like super manly, like all that stuff. And I think there are a few problems was that he was extremely narcissistic to the point where I'm not sure that he would listen to Belle at all, like in this concept that we're talking about of like a household vote, or like the man has the responsibility to treat the woman well so that he'll represent her well, like all that stuff. I'm not sure that he would have fulfilled that. But the whole part about her like falling in love with the beast, even though he's like a different species. I mean, I did wonder about that too, but I think it was also the beast did exhibit some of those manly qualities of protection and all that stuff, except that he actually saw Belle as a person with ideas and that kind of thing. So there are parts that I'm like, he has a point. And then there's some parts that I'm like, I feel like he didn't, I'm not sure that he knows the story well enough.
The Family Plan Calendar is the new way to keep your family team organized. Plan your rhythms, menu, household chores, and notes for the family all in one place. Visit familyteams.com to purchase.
Yeah, like at the end, he wasn't trying to rescue Belle because Belle had already like come to them in the village. So she was fine because the beast let her go, but he went to kill the beast anyway. So there was that. But yeah.
Well, I think one of the things, so within the symbolic world of the story,
Yeah.
it's not fair to talk about the beast like all of a sudden as a literal other species.
Yeah.
The question that I'm wrestling with, and he's making a really interesting point that I really think it's worth wrestling through, and that is that, to your point, the thing that made the beast attractive was that he was recovering from selfish narcissism, right? As a so
Yeah.
you have basically, and then in Gaston was basically unreformable, and you kind of, the sense what is, the whole idea behind Beauty and the Beast is there's a dream that girls have to reform the bad boy, like to there's an attractiveness to sort of a guy um who's struggling with ethics and who he is, but he has to be reformable. So this is the real danger that a woman has.
Yeah.
You kind of, you want to get somebody who's raw but good material. And the story is that she had, of course, zero romantic interest in the beast until all of a sudden she discovers that he is reformable. And I think that the point that the movie is making about Gaston is that he's unreformable. There's no, you are stuck with somebody for the rest of your life who will only be looking out for himself. Now, part of looking out for himself is he does want to raise a family and he wants to have a wife, but they frame that as a wife purely for his own preferences. Like, and they really try to make that point. And so I think one of the things that's interesting, if I'm going to try to take Matt Walsh's argument seriously, and I love the way he frames everything. It's fascinating, and
I know
it's
he's
really
hilarious.
it's a really good question. Um, and I think the way I guess I would ask, and I'm curious what you think, is that if you were to write a story where what the female lead wants is um, a reformable man versus a hyper capable narcissistic man.
Mm.
Um, what what is the right answer there? Is there any clarity around, and that is it better? Is Belle making the better choice? Um, from literarily, what do you think?
I think so because it's hard to see how someone's gonna change. And I feel like she was smart in her like she's a very smart girl. That's like her character trait of like, yes, she's beautiful, but like and Gaston only wants her because she's the most beautiful one in the village and stuff, but she has a brain. She like thinks very deeply about these things, so she could tell that he was being shallow. Which is not what a girl should look for. Like there are the other like the three airhead girls like in the other song. It's like, oh Gaston, Gaston. It's like they're painted kind of ridiculously for a reason because it's like you do not want to be like that. You
Yeah.
need to use your brain, make sure that you are finding a guy that is reformable, that has shown evidence that he can reform. Like, yeah, with the beast, it's an extreme example because he had to be transformed into a beast in order and like be hideous in order to like work on himself and not just like his outward appearance, like things like that. Which I like stories like that because there's one in Howl's Moving Castle, where a girl is like very insecure and like has to stop thinking about her appearance and start like working on herself in order to feel lovable. And so it's slightly different, but you can either be super self-obsessed in the way that you hate yourself or love yourself a lot. And that's an issue that is very difficult to have as a partner. So it's good to like be like if you're considering someone as a mate, it's good that it's good to get them when they're already on their journey of
Yeah.
or like towards the end of their journey. Like I don't expect anyone to be perfect, especially if you're getting very young. You might not have like a guy that's very secure yet, but if he is like well on his way, that's definitely better than a guy that is still way over there in the narcissistic category.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's good to be critical of that kind of thing, especially.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that that's the part of this. The challenge here is that you want Belle to be with somebody who's not completely formed, and part of when you're getting married young, you can tell Gaston is like he's already at the very top. He seems almost like a widower or somebody who's been divorced. Like he's fully his identity is so formed and so
Made
complete.
it.
Yeah. That I think that that's part of what is really unattractive to somebody as open as Belle, who's reading and growing and thinking like, am I really going to be yoked to this guy who can't ever think a new thought? So yeah, but I love this. This is a really fantastic.
What I do like about the um like the contrast between Gaston and the Beast is that it's not like alpha beta situation going on where like I mean maybe
Yeah.
let's take Gaston as like an alpha. But
Yes.
it's not that you have to not be manly because the
Right.
Beast like like the first scene that made Belle like realize that he was actually cool was that he was fighting off a bunch of wolves. Like that's so manly, like
Yes.
protecting her and like sacrificing himself. He gets injured and then she takes care of him. Like that's very like feminine, masculine, like really sweet. Like I love that scene. Where she's like helping him like clean the wound and stuff like that. Like that's very like picturesque,
Yes.
feminine masculine relationship. So I like that they didn't have to sacrifice his masculinity in order to show that he's a good person and he'll like take care of her.
Yeah.
So
I remember Joseph Campbell once described the most lovable character in many stories is the Han Solo character who's like super selfish, but can't stop himself from being unselfish when somebody he loves is in danger. And I think that's definitely the character quality you see in the Beast.
mm,
That idea, that's kind of what creates almost a maximally lovable character because you're primed to think he's evil. And then all of a sudden you discover that he's not, that he's really good and that he's pretending to be evil.
That's so true.
Yeah, that does something to to your heart. That's in a story that's really powerful.
I can think of so many books where like people fall so hard for the guy that is exactly like that.
Yeah.
As often the love interest trope.
Yep.
So
All right, last one. Would love to hear what your thoughts are about this. So, I'm fascinated by the idea of copyrights. So, I want to talk about this event that's occurring and just thinking through what it means. And I'm curious what you think of this. So,
Won't just mean the start of a new year. It will also be when copyright protections expire on a number of well-known books, films, and musical compositions. That includes works like All Quiet on the Western Front, Peter Pan, and the Marx Brothers musical Animal Crackers. But one work that's entering the public domain on 2024 is getting a lot of attention. CBS News senior business and technology correspondent Jolene Kent has the story.
It's a simple early rendition of perhaps the most recognizable cartoon character ever created. The 1928 animated short Steamboat Willie marked the film debut of Mickey Mouse. And Minnie, too. Now, almost 100 years later, this landmark piece of entertainment will enter the public domain, meaning Disney will lose its right to control it, and others can use the images as they wish. This was set to happen years ago, until Disney, with other groups, got Congress to pass extensions. But the last of them expires at midnight on New Year's Eve.
And what basically is happening now is that we will be able to do to the great works of Disney what Disney did to the great works of the public domain before him. And that's how creativity is supposed to happen. We build on our past.
Lawrence Lessig is a Harvard law professor and expert on copyright issues.
So this is a bit of a full circle moment then.
Absolutely. And I think Disney should celebrate that, because what we know about the creativity of Walt Disney and the Disney Corporation is that they've made stories relevant to our current time.
So starting on Monday, anyone has the legal right to use Mickey and Minnie Mouse in new creative works like books and films. But there's an important caveat. It has to be the Steamboat Willie versions, not the more familiar renditions of the characters that followed.
What are the limitations? What are you not allowed to do?
You cannot use the characters in a way that misleads consumers into thinking that Disney has produced or sponsored your product.
Jennifer Jenkins teaches at Duke Law School, specializing in intellectual property and the public domain.
The way I think about that is the public domain is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get.
A case in point, Winnie the Pooh.
Winnie the Pooh, Winnie the Pooh.
He walked out of the 100-acre wood and into the public domain 2 years ago, when the original literary work lost its protection. And that led to this. Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, a critically panned, low-budget slasher film where the beloved characters go on a murderous rampage.
Blood and Honey was buzzworthy because of the shock value, because it grossed people out. But in the long run, our culture gets to decide what kinds of public domain reuses have enduring appeal. Disney is the poster child for just how valuable the public domain is. If you think about their beloved movies that we've all watched, so many of them are based on public domain works. We've got The Lion King and Frozen and The Little Mermaid and Sleeping Beauty and Snow White. I could go on. And so that makes this moment deeply symbolic and highly anticipated, because Mickey Mouse is the emblem of both of those tendencies.
Steamboat Willie is getting lots of attention, but in recent years, copyright expirations have become routine. Over the years, many other characters have entered the public domain without much fanfare, including Tarzan, Sherlock Holmes, and even Frankenstein's monster.
What are some of the high-profile characters that will enter the public domain in the next few years?
So we have a lot to look forward to in the next few years. We've got Donald Duck, we've got Superman, we've got Batman, and we've also got movies such as The Wizard of Oz, Casablanca, Gone with the Wind. So we have a lot of wonderful works and a lot of forgotten works going into the public domain in the next few years.
You're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz.
For CBS Saturday Morning, Jolene Kent, Los Angeles.
All right. What do you think?
Um, that's interesting. I like I remember the drama with Spider-Man a few years back with how like Sony, I think, owned him, and then
Yep.
like he wanted to buy like
When
there was a
Disney
lot
bought
of
Marvel, I think Sony had the maybe like a cinematic, and then Disney bought the comic book version. There was like two versions of Spider-Man that were
oh
they weren't public domain, but yeah, there was two versions that were being sold. Yeah.
yeah, that's it. It leads to problems when people have copyrights over and like kind of a restriction on creativity. So I guess that's good that there is like possibilities for these characters to enter the public domain. Anyone can make stuff about them. Um, yeah, I guess I'm not like well informed on it. I'm like, it seems like there could be issues with that.
Right.
Like
Well,
my instinct is like there could be problems though. Like um with the whole Winnie the Pooh thing, I think it's kind of funny, but it's like something
yeah.
could happen to like destroy these characters in some way.
Right.
So
Yeah, there's it's definitely what's really tricky is because there's definitely value there, and then once it's free, it's a free for all. People can just grab that value and do all kinds of ridiculous things to sort of extract the value, in ways that just really dilute the the actual value of the property. But I think that the overarching thing that I'm interested in is that I think most creativity, most story creativity, is where certain symbols enter the public's consciousness, right? So you have these ideas. We just were looking at Beauty and the Beast. That's a great example where it's now almost a part of the symbolic architecture of the way we think. But let's say when you're writing a story, you are not allowed to have access to that. So I think for me, the best example, of course, is Tolkien. So, I mean, his writings are incredibly deeply embedded in my like the architecture of the way I think about my in any kind of imaginary world. Hobbits are a part of it, and I could never write a book that even referenced a hobbit. Whereas when Tolkien was writing, he was writing books that were referencing elves, which he didn't invent, and dwarves, which he didn't invent. All of these existed in the public domain by the time he was writing. But that's what made up his architecture. But he's a part of my architecture, but I can't use his property. And so I think that we're trying to find a sweet spot between making sure that the author during his lifetime can get the full benefit of what he's created and can protect the things that he's made from being, you know, dragged to the mud the way that those filmmakers were doing with Winnie the Pooh.
Like what you hear? Be sure to leave a rating and review for this podcast wherever you use streaming.
But then after he dies, how many generations have to go by where you've created the symbolic architecture for future generations who don't have access to using that architecture when they're actually making stories? There's a real problem there that needs to be resolved. And the way that Congress resolved this was that they had something like a 30-year limit, or maybe a 40. It's basically a 1 or 2 generations. And I think that what happened with Disney was that like that Mickey Mouse 1928 version was supposed to be released in the public domain in the 80s, and they've made a 40-year extension, 2 20-year extensions. And so now you have multiple generations that have lived and died with that being a part of their symbolic architecture without having any access to using that when they're writing stories. Stories are supposed to be the remixture of symbolic ideas.
yeah.
So this is where I think it's such an important topic for us to have a conviction around. What do we do with that tension?
Yeah, I feel like there's so much creative people can do with these characters. And so I feel like it could be so fun for them to just go ham and like make some kind of crossover or like,
Yeah.
just stuff like that that could be fun. Um but it can get out of hand. So it's good that there is some amount of protection around the creation of these people, but then like it can get kind of dumb. Like I remember when um Avengers 2 came out and then like Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver were in it and they couldn't use those names because they like didn't have the copyright, whatever. So it's just like Wanda and Pietro. And I remember being like, why? I love their comic book names. Like, why aren't they using them? And it's like, well, they can't because of legal stuff. And I'm like, that's dumb. So like, there is some parts that I'm like, this is a creative thing. Like, why? How can you own a name? So it is a really like dicey, weird, like controversial thing. That's like, I feel like I could go both ways, where I could get mad on both fronts or like understand both fronts. Um. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, one of the things one of the reasons why I want to bring it up kind of in our family roundup is that I think I really want us to pursue remixing and articulating really well designed symbols from stories of the past. And so we need to be aware when these things do fall into the public domain. And so things like The Wizard of Oz or Peter Pan are incredibly powerful stories that need that like I would love, I mean, as our family kind of gets into, I think, has more of a literary, critical explanation voice within the story realm. Because of, I think, one of the things that makes our family, I think, one of the distinctives of our family is just how much we all love stories and how much we're impacted by symbols, and I think how much we're able to, even in a lot of cases, articulate the meaning behind symbols. And so, as these to really understand which works are beginning to expire and become more available for exploration. I think we should really consider making books, writing books, explaining and remixing and playing with some of those symbols in an appropriate way. I think that it's I think we have to be aware that the fact that people can do inappropriate things with these characters and these symbols does not mean that they're now devoid of value, or that we should be cavalier about the way that we're using these characters. We need to on one hand, I would love to get to play around within Tolkien's world without having any restrictions. But of course, I know that there's going to be just some of the worst art ever devised as soon as his work hits the public domain. And the fact that it was protected is what gave us Peter Jackson's trilogy. Like, nobody would have ever spent $100 million on that intellectual property if they couldn't protect it. And so I have a lot of, I do think that there needs to be a season where it's protected and that people with a profit incentive are able to get the maximum value out of it before it starts to lapse into the public. And then I think the peasants get to play.
I'm just afraid of like the rings of power, like they or like conveyed.
Yes.
What's the word there? Like they just did not convey the correct spirit of Tolkien.
Right.
And even that was like legal.
Right.
So it's like, what's going to happen when it's,
it doesn't protect you.
Yeah.
Yeah. They deeply violated the basic ethical world of Tolkien. This is, to me, the unforgivable sin of Rings of Power. That they use those symbols and they use them in ways that Tolkien would have been absolutely appalled at its meaning. And Peter Jackson was so clear in his interviews that they were not going to try to use Tolkien's works to preach an ethic that he would not have agreed with, but to just go along with the brilliant way that, I mean, Tolkien was such a wise man. And so this is one of the things that, yeah, the copyright doesn't protect you from potentially misusing the works. And so that's going to be done. And I think Disney and Frozen, really violated that. And I think they violated it in multiple movies that they've made. I've heard that, a part of the way that what they did with the Little Mermaid. So yeah, I think you always run that risk. But on the other hand, I think that it's useful to let people use the symbols and play with them and try to see if those symbols actually do support their ideologies. And one of the things I loved about Rings of Power is that so many people saw through it and it just didn't resonate. And I think that that's very instructive when you try to force an ideology. What's going on with Snow White, the remake of Snow White, is really clear that the public can sense when you are when you're basically doing violence to the world, that the symbolic world that was originally created in order to make propaganda. Like, we can tell, and you're going to pay for it. And I think that sometimes people that may not have nearly the control of the property, because it's in the public domain, can actually unveil some of the really beautiful, true, and hidden meanings in a lot of these stories. And that's what I'm excited about seeing people do. Well, thanks, Sid, for being on this with me today. I love getting to
Yeah.
do the roundup, and we'll see you next time.
All right, cool.
Thank you for listening to Jeremy Pryor's podcast. Make sure you hit that follow button so you don't miss out on any future content. Follow Jeremy on Twitter and Instagram, as well as his Substack blog, all linked in the description. See you next time.